Well, you all must be calendar keepers, because when you have 5 weeks spread out over about 9, figuring out which weeks this is happening, you must be calendar keepers. So good for you. Welcome this evening. After our 4th session, I sat down with David and Angie because I wanted to talk some about, so what should we do for number 5? Because we intentionally kept the 5th session somewhat open in anticipation and somewhat not knowing. So what would Bishop Schnase be talking about? What would have happened at General Conference and the like? And so as we talked, what occurred to me is the broken record that plays in my head. And this happens to a lot of scholars, and I'm sure not just a lot of scholars, because if you found something in life that's one of those, it's a perpetual question for you. It's a good question, meaning it's a really good problem. The really good questions are the ones that don't have one answer. And when you think you've got it solved, something else comes up and you have to rethink it again. And for a lot of us, that's what we call the life project. Well, my dissertation was expressive of what I consider to be really one of my fundamental questions I put to the world, put to my own world, put to my own self. And the question is about, what is the nature of the community we seek? What does community really mean? We talk about it all the time. We often talk about it like we ought to have more of it. What's the it we want to have more of? What does it really look like? What are its contours? What are its shape? What are its values? And for a good part of my life, and this is somewhat, I think, being a middle child, the negotiator. And I can't be happy unless everybody's happy, which means I have a fair amount of unhappy time. As I mentioned at the very first session, the ecumenical movement was really in full swing when I was a kid and moving into my teenage years, and then even was still pretty much a thing in the early part of my college years. So the churches trying to overcome divisions amongst us that are, some of them 500 years old, some of them more like 1,000 years old. Some of them, we might argue, go back to which book of the New Testament do you most take after, and all. I thought this was exciting times, and for somebody who likes to see unity, good. Well, you find the ecumenical movement got itself hung up on there were a number of issues they got hung up on, one of which was what kind of structure could house the whole of Christ's church. And I can't tell you, in the kind of the 50s, 60s era, the number of times when some push towards unity got hung up by, how would you combine pension plans? Or what are you going to do with churches of the denominations that might be uniting that are sitting on the same corner, kitty corner from each other? Who's giving up who's building? Which often gets translated to who's giving up whose church, not just building, right? So I thought also from some philosophical points of view, I thought that maybe unity wasn't the question to be asking anymore, but really community would be. And so I wrote a dissertation on that it really ought to shift the question from the nature of the unity we seek to the nature of the community we seek. So community is the theme of the evening, and this is like variations on the theme of community. And I want you to keep what Bishop Snagey said in mind, that the further up you go on the hierarchy, which also means into the structures of things, that the exoskeleton that we've put together to try to hold everything under one roof, further up we go, the more cantankerous and polarized we seem to be. But oftentimes, on a more local level, like Schnase said, is a lot of times church has it figured out. Just let the churches who have things figured out, let them keep on with their lives, figuring out what community means for them. So I think that's a good theme to pick up with for this evening. So we're going to have 3 different segments to what we're going to do. First, I'm going to talk some about what I mean by the nature of the community we see. And then secondly, I'm going to tell a story, and we've asked 3 other persons to tell their own stories that relate to kind of how they came to a point of view regarding some element of diversity, and maybe even how they changed their mind or developed at times. And then we're going to close with communion. And when I think about what community is, fundamentally, you often think about what do communities do? Well, they share stories and they eat. Right? And I can't imagine, if you can't imagine a good community, and it's kind of interesting. You might say there's a bad society. You almost never hear somebody say there's a bad community. Right? I mean, it's kind of interesting, because when we think community, we often put more positive into it.
It's more intimate.
Pardon me?
It's more intimate.
It is absolutely more intimate. Right. A society can't be anything more than kind of an association of communities. And it is. It's more attenuated. It's absolutely more spread out. But also, when we think about community, I think we think about it in terms of there's a goodness to it. Well, I think any community that's worth calling itself a community does at least 2 things. They share some fundamental stories, and there's a vulnerability allowed in sharing those stories, and they eat together. And the Christian community, the Christian communities over time, certainly we've told core stories, and we have this shared table that together. So that's what we're going to do this evening. So I'm going to start with the part on some of the nature of the community we seek. A book I think I referenced last time because I had just finished it, and it's made a profound impact for me on at this time. And it starts with a quote from Anne Carson, Anne's quote at the start of this book. The book is called "The End of the Myth," and it's kind of that manifest destiny theme, and the way that that author's seeing the American frontier experience that continued right up until about Vietnam. That there was always a new frontier, whether it was a physical frontier or it became markets and other places to sell things as the new frontiers. And think about how Star Trek, the original Star Trek, started in the 1960s. Space, the final frontier. Right, so that frontier theme to keep playing through. He said Vietnam really brought an end to that. And from then on, there's been one effort after another that the frontier becomes a wall. And a concern about who we have invited into into the United States and the need to now protect ourselves from a more dangerous world. Well, this quote from Ann Carson to me gave me pause because it I think speaks to the time we're in. She said, "To live past the end of your myth is a perilous thing." To live past the end of your myth is a perilous thing. Now, your myth, remember, is not your untruth. When religious scholars and all, when they talk about myth, what they're talking is about, in fact, your deepest truth. The one that isn't necessarily based only in history, but it's a way of rooting your deepest values, your sense of where you came from, where you're headed. To live past the end of your myth is a perilous thing. Well, I think, again, as we think about what I've tried to cover in the previous 4 weeks, I think it's really clear that as a nation right now, we do not have a shared myth. The myth that had been postulated by predominantly white, predominantly male, predominantly Christian leaders over the years is just not widely shared now. It's debated, obviously, and it's fought over, but it is not widely shared. As a United Methodist Church, I think one of our questions at this point is, have we lived past our myth? Right? We understood ourselves, we have understood ourselves ever since the Second Great Awakening, ever since the camp meeting era of the early 1800s, when Methodism and then Baptists and somewhat disciples, but especially Methodism, just blew up in terms of numbers. And we became the most populous, by far, denomination on the continent. And in some places, we really put a church in every single county in a state, at least one. We're so dominant. We were a big tent church. What was interesting is after the civil, with the 1844 split over slavery and bishop's authority, and then after the Civil War, we still remained a very strong northern church and a very strong southern church as far as dominating the population, and we were still a Big Ten church. And one of the reasons why we were so profoundly both affected the Civil War as well affected by the Civil War is because we were the Big Ten church. If there was a problem in the United States, there was a problem in the Methodist Church. And in the middle 1800s, in fact, there was one legislator who just, when the Methodists split, he said, "Oh my gosh, there goes the country." Wouldn't be said now, right? We're just in a different place. Are we still the Big Ten church? That's kind of the one church plan, one could say, is another attempt at trying to be a Big Ten church. Personally, I hope it's successful. On that one, we'll see. We may be living past the end of our myth. The story I've told in prior weeks, I think, has deconstructed or taken apart the narrative that we often hear and that some of us, in fact, grew up with, that it's the last few decades have really brought a loss of social cohesion in the United States, where we used to be so united as a society and now we're so coming apart. When in fact, our separateness has been coming for a long time. There's a book written in 1975 by an author, Harold Isaacs, called Idols of the Tribe. And he has this quote in there that it's a little bit lengthy, but I'm going to linger over it for a moment. 1975. We are experiencing on a massively universal scale a convulsive ingathering of people. That's a great phrase, convulsive ingathering of people in their numberless groupings of kinds, tribal, racial, linguistic, religious, national. It is a great clustering into separatenesses that will, it is thought, improve, assure, or extend each group's power or place, and keep it safe or safer from the power, threat, or hostility of others. This is 1975. This is obviously no new condition, only the latest and by far the most inclusive chapter of the old story, in which, after failing again to find how they can coexist in sight of each other without tearing each other limb from limb, Isaac and Ishmael clash and part in panic and retreat once more into their caves. Now, I don't know why I took Isaac and Ishmael. I might have thought Jacob and Esau, or even Jacob and Laban. Remember Jacob and Laban? That's where we get we get this line coming from Laban that, may the Lord stay between me and thee, at the end of the Jacob and Laban narrative. And some people use that. I've seen some pastors use that as a blessing at the end of a service. But if you read it in context, Jacob and Laban have scammed each other repeatedly. They can't stand each other. They're bad for each other. So they decide to set up this rock pile, this cairn, as a boundary or barrier between them. And Laban's saying to him, may the Lord stay between me and thee, because if God doesn't, I might come after you. This is not a blessing. So, that might Jacob and Laban I would have used in there, but age old. What this author is arguing is, in fact, that all of the efforts to try to live in a more ecumenical or cosmopolitan way, that they all pale in comparison to rich textual local cultures. And that, if you want to go experience, one example of this is if you want to go experience Amish life, are you going to stop at the little roadside market sort of thing in a strip mall? Or are you going to, go to a farm? Are you going to experience the fullness of the culture? You're going to get a little sampling of it. If you want to experience, and for those of you who know this cuisine, you'll know why I say it this way. If you want to experience an Ethiopian restaurant, you don't get that as fast food. Why? Because everything is brought to you as a communal bowl. And you get this fermented bread-like material, I can't remember what it's called, that is used as your wrap or your spoon, and everybody eats out of a bowl. You can't do that as fast food. His argument is that we haven't found a satisfying way that isn't basically tribal to really live. And that's a concern. I think that one of the testimonies most missing or nearly muted in this day of high polarization and talk of schism in a variety of levels of the culture, not just in churches. I think that that the religious testimony that humankind is created for community is in fact been too muted. I think that may be one of the chief contributions we can make as religious people in public life, is to say, you can't go this alone. That's not the way we were created. For those of you who had to read Aristotle in college or some other class. One of his most famous sayings is, the human animal is a political animal. And by political animal, he means, of the polis. It has to be face-to-face relationships. People are made, are formed in relationship with other people. We are not well formed at birth to just go off on your own and not to have to participate in culture and face-to-face contact. And in fact, one of the things that scientists have studied the brain, some MIT researchers have brought out that babies need what? They need facial contact in order to actually form as human beings. Screens don't do it, by the way. Just seeing a screen, the baby seeing the screen, there's different things happen in that baby's brain than actually seeing the face of a parent close up and regularly, a caregiver regularly over time. We need to be formed together. Aristotle also, he was the one, we get the English word is idiot, but Aristotle said basically the most dangerous kind of person is an idiot, meaning idios, person who is into themselves and can't participate in any way in the polis, can't participate in any way in the community. The isolated individual, the kind of person that we fear today for what happens to them when they get resentful and they have an AK-47 and an AR-15 in their possession. So community. What can religious people be talking about more in terms of community? Unity often gets confused with uniformity. And so that's one of the reasons too why I thought, let's talk more about community than about unity. But when we talk about unity and community, then you get, in the church's history, you get this interesting dynamic that I think we still deal with some, which is, everybody remember Plato? So I got Aristotle here, I might as well bring Plato in. And for Plato, things here on earth are all shadows of things in an eternal realm. These are the kind of poor, somewhat degraded knockoff copies. And that sort of understanding of reality into that division between things degraded and things pure or pristine above made its way into a lot of Christian theology in the early centuries. So that true families in heaven, and we live in a what Augustine called the corpus permixtum, the mixture of weeds and tares all mixed in together here, and in heaven the church will finally be pure. Well, in this understanding, the church in Jesus Christ, the church is whole and undivided. But how it manifests here on earth is all these divisions, and the divisions equal sinfulness. All divisions between Christians here, all different denominations. If you don't all call yourself Christian, then there's sin in here. And in the Orthodox conception of church and in the Roman Catholic conception of church, you still see this Platonic philosophy being played out. There is a true church. There is one church that represents the true church, mostly, on earth, and everybody else is some further division off of that. Aristotle's way of looking at it would be, no, there's a church here, there's a church here, there's a church here, there's a church here, there's a church here. Now, what is it that might bring them together? And I've always been an Aristotelian rather than a Platonist. The original unity, it all fell and now we're all broken up. No, I actually think the diversity of practices has been overall good for Christianity. Not perfect, but overall better than any kind of massive exoskeleton of unity. When we talk about community, I think that we have to ask questions about what's the origin of a community, what's its trajectory, where is it headed, and what's its circumference. By origin, I'm talking about its founding narratives and myths, how a particular people became attached to this land, this folklore, who the founders were, who the matriarchs and patriarchs are. I mean, it's the kind of things where here at Boston Avenue, as lectureships come around, as the Messiah comes around, and then as the core values are being re-expressed, you're hearing a lot about founding narratives of the church. When you talk about nations, I love the story that Seymour Martin Lipset tells in a book called Continental Divide, which is about the founding stories of Canada versus the founding stories of the United States. And he says, a lot of people in the United States just think about Canada as U.S. North. And don't know a whole lot about Canadians. Kind of a little surprised about the socialized medicine and that sort of thing, and quite surprised to find out all of the persons of Asian descent that live in Canada, and that there's also issues that they've had about Indigenous persons there, and there's no Methodists in Canada, really? What's this United Church of Canada? So it's kind of interesting about what we don't know about Canadians, other than Adair, Hoser, and hockey. He said no. It says the United States is born in revolution. Canada is born as the extension of British North American culture, and has never departed from being an extension of British North American culture. I like to point it out that when there was Olympics a number of years back now, one year was in Calgary and another year was in LA. And in Calgary, you had like a pomp and circumstance, like you would think, are you in some, is this in Hanover, Germany, or where is this? It looks like it's completely upscale, royal, regimented, dignified, and that's Calgary. And that's Calgary. That's Western up there, Canada. I mean, this is, but a whole lot of British North America. Whereas at LA Olympics is when first time you saw a man in a jetpack go flying around the stadium. I just thought it was a great contrast between, some things in the nations. Founding narratives, myths. What's our origin? What's our origin story? And then what's your trajectory? What's our purpose? What are we here to do? I think that's also an interesting question, both to put to the nation as well as put to our church at this point. What are we here to do? I know a lot of us were taken by Abraham Lincoln's rhetoric, who the most fabulous interpreter of that rhetoric in the 20th century was Martin Luther King Jr., about democracy being humankind's last best hope, and something about then the moral leadership that goes along with being a lead democratic country. That sounds like something I could get behind. In terms of church purpose, what is the purpose of the United Methodist Church? When you say, well, we've got a purpose statement, you've got the statement about the making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. Right, and we all know that there's a very strong evangelical personal salvation way of interpreting that, and a very strong social justice way of interpreting that. And some of us who were taught in seminary by persons who still identified as evangelical liberals thought you could do both of those. Why did you have to split them? But it's harder and harder to keep that together. What's the trajectory? What's the purpose? There's the origin, there's trajectory, and the circumference. What's the reach? Where's the limits of our competence and our authority? What kinds of boundaries do we erect? Every community needs boundaries. I know we talk about radical hospitality, and every time I hear it, I want to say, okay, tell me what an open circle is. When you really think about that, tell me what an open circle is. It just goes on forever. This is where when I talk about the nature of the community we seek, I want to say, what are human beings capable of in terms of hospitality, embracing diversity? And I want to say, on the one hand, I believe strongly that what Christianity is, what Jesus was about, is to be yeast in every culture in which it takes hold. Yeast of love, yeast of kindness, yeast of compassion, yeast of justice, yeast of dissolving some of the boundaries that people have put up that defines us versus them, and you're not my neighbor. I firmly believe that what Jesus was about was saying to us, you have to love your family, but your family is bigger than you think. All right, but does that mean absolutely unbounded? I don't know that we can do that. So in any community, even the most hospitable community, when I do any kind of church culture study, I will look at it and say, let me see if I can find out how you manifest your boundaries. Every community manifests its boundaries. Starting with this, any church that's in a traditional church building, which I'll call this one such, there are boundaries here. One is, it looks like a church. Now, is that a good boundary or a bad boundary? I don't know. It depends on who you are. I mean, and there are a lot of people who are very attracted to this church because it looks like a church. It's gorgeously done. It is thoroughgoingly Art Deco meets Gothic, and unique in so many ways, and all. But then there's okay, how do I get in there? Where are the doors? Which is the entrance? And if you're differently abled, how do you make your way in? And all those kinds of things. I mean, so those are just the one kind of boundary, and then the other is, other kind of the ones that I can tell your staff is paying some attention to these days. So, for instance, there are all kinds of boundaries that we set up by the way you go through a liturgy. Do you assume that your liturgy is the equivalent of a football huddle, where everybody in the huddle knows what the play is? And if you're looking from the outside, you're going to go, I don't quite know what's going on here. I think a lot of congregations are making that transition to from the kind of football huddle version of church, where we really love each other. I don't know why more people don't want to come here, because we're such a fine community. Right, and you look like that football huddle. The person's coming in from the outside, and they don't know how to break into it. There are all kinds of ways we talk about boundaries. Every community has its boundaries. How do they manifest? What I also found interesting when we talk about nature of community, a Christian community, is when you look not only at Jesus, but then you look at emerging Christianity as it was in Paul in Acts, and just taking Paul in Galatians, where he says, in Christ there is neither Jew nor Greek. Okay, that means that those are the two major, for Jews, these are two major categories of nationality, so it's transnational. Being in Christ is transnational. Neither slave nor free, two classes in society, trans class. Neither male nor female. I'll tell some of your conservative friends, think the Bible's a little transgender here. Really is. Male and female were in fact different. There were different ways of being baptized into Judaism for men than for women. So this is to say that maleness and femaleness is not essentially different when it comes to Jesus, when it comes to relationship to Christ. And let's not also forget that Paul also says in 1 Corinthians that it's better to be celibate than married. So you could even say somewhat transsexual, as in sex doesn't matter when it comes to being in Christ. I want to underline when we talk about the nature of community that we have to be talking about the substance of community, which is its culture. These shared stories, shared purpose, shared trajectory, shared sense of who we are, also who we are not. You can't substitute a polity for culture. Polity is, the way we organize ourselves. Again, I'll refer to it as an exoskeleton. I think some of you read the same article I did by Bishop Williman, who said that what we see in the United Methodist Church today is that we've tried to hold together a polity when we don't have a shared culture. Not only shared culture between the African United Methodists and some U.S. United Methodists, but also somewhat not shared culture among some U.S. United Methodists. I'm putting things together here. Interesting how the USSR became the USSR by trying to create an exoskeleton to combine all of these other nations into one huge empire. And when that wall fell and the USSR came apart, what happened? So all those national cultures came roaring back. Idols of the tribe again. The state can't hold everything together, and I think that's also in the United States today. We are having that issue of e pluribus unum has always been a dream, not necessarily reality, and I think we're really struggling with the culture that holds us together. For Christians, one of the key elements of our culture has been the table. How was Christ revealed to his disciples in the post-resurrection appearances in Luke? And in the conversation with them and in the breaking of the bread. I find it interesting that up until very modern times, I mean, people want to say this is traditional, it is not. Up until very modern times, anything regarding sexuality has not been a table fellowship breaking practice. If you decided that Christ wasn't divine, that might have been. Or that the Holy Spirit proceed from the Father and the Son, or from the Father alone. Well, that was the East versus the West, and the like. Those were table-breaking things. But anything regarding sexuality has not been a table breaker. So I think this is two things I want to do now, and as we draw to our conclusion here. So let's go ahead and say goodbye to the Facebook group, because we've got some stories we're going to tell leading up